Welcome to the module Financing of Social Investments in Africa. This is module number 3, and we take this as the core. Why it is the core is because it deals with exactly what the module is about. So we will approach this module as follows. We will split first the financing of social investments into 2 approaches. The first one, we will call it a positive approach, and then the second one, we will call it a normative approach. Each of these approaches should give you an idea of how we may arrive at a social budget or a budget that could constitute our social investment. Now, the takeaway that you're going to find from this module is that social insurance is not, or rather use the word, is rarely funded from government financing throughout Africa. It is mostly a prerogative of the employer as well as the employee, both in the private sector as well as in the public sector. Social assistance, in turn, is tax financed and constitute most of the of the financing from the government coffers. Some will call social assistance non-contributory because they will be saying no one contributes anything but they are getting money. We wouldn't use that term because it connotes that the poor never finance the public pays. They do, and we're going to see how. Because the poor also finance the public pays. If they are given money, it's not wrong. It's very right. It's not like they are dependent on the state. No, because everyone is dependent on something anyway. So we'll be calling this one tax financed social assistance. We will end by discussing the domestic sources of financing and the further options that countries may have to improve their domestic financial envelope. So we will start with the positive approach to social budgeting. So this approach basically examines the social spending practice across a range of countries and then arriving at some estimate through an inductive process. By that, what do we mean? If you look at the graph in the PowerPoint, you will realize that in the year 2000, about 7.5% was committed to the health budgets in Africa. So a country that is trying to decide on how much to budget for health, for instance, it would look at the average of the health expenditures in Africa. Should it like, it may narrow it down to its region. It could be, if it's in Central Africa, it would look at how much is the average spending on health as a percent of GDP in its region, and then it will commit a similar percent for its own budgeting purposes. If you look at 2015, the average in Africa is 7.2% of GDP that was spent towards health. So as you budget in a country, you may want to also have about 7.2%. So this approach, we've presented it here simplistically, but it works empirically, and it simply takes the average of either the region or the whole of Africa to arrive at a particular budget. This approach is very different from a normative approach. Instead, a normative approach starts from a needs assessment and then course the budget for appropriate interventions, as in from the bottom going up. What do I mean by that? The normative approach will look at the number of poor persons that the country has. If these person or if these people need $1 a day, or if they need the total 1.90 US dollar per day, then the budgets will be such that we add the number of people who are in need of this money per day, and then we look at how much we will need to budget to give people this money per day to come out of poverty. So that will be your normative approach to social budgeting. If you are to look at the health sector, the education sector, the housing sector, you would also come back to the ground, do a needs assessment. If, let's say, in the housing part, look at people who are homeless, look at people who do not have the housing structure that is recommended, and then you do a budgeting from them, starting from their needs and then arriving at a national figure. So these are basically the two approaches. You realize that if we are to compare them, the normative approach is usually costly. It will demand a lot of money because it definitely looks at the needs that are there and how they should be fulfilled. Whilst the positive approach simply takes the regional average and then provides the people whether it be enough or not. I must say most countries in Africa typically use a positive approach. And we just saw it recently with COVID-19, a module that we're going to do later, but I'll use an example from there to say a lot of countries ended up committing 10% budget to COVID because they had seen that most countries, that's what they are doing. So that was a positive approach to budgeting. Now let me move on to the financing of social assistance. We are picking social assistance mostly because it constitutes a lot of our public pays compared to social insurance as well as access to social services, for instance. Now, most financing of social assistance is emanated either from the donors or from the domestic sources, or both. But here we want to look at the trend of financing between the donors as well as the domestic sources. Now, there are about 16 programs where we have got data that are financed by donors. In these programs, we see that the average spending, that is the spending per program per year, you'll find that it is 51.5 million for donor funded programs, and then the average is 1.4 billion for domestic funded programs, and we're at 21 of these. Now, this is very important because it begins to show that where there is domestic financing, governments get to commit to social assistance and they pour in a lot of money. Let's bring it down a bit and we talk in terms of the adequacy of social assistance. Now, by adequacy, we mean like the money transferred to the poor person, and we see if it is closer to lifting the person out of poverty, monetarily that is. So we would want to always check if it is closer to taking a person to $1.90 per day. We've got data from 6 donor funded programs. Their average cash transfer per month to a participant in a program is almost $18 per month. But if we look at programs that are funded domestically, the average cash transfer per month to a participant is $74. Now, this begins to tell us that once governments have committed to financing social assistance, they tend to be adequate compared to the donors. If you also look at the institutionalization of programs, where there is domestic financing, programs tend to be permanent. That is, they are institutionalized, or they now have a mandate. It could be from a ministry, it could be from an agency, and this mandate goes beyond a political party, goes beyond a current president. It is institutionalized. If you look at the donor funded programs, they are mostly pilots, right? So on the 8 that we have got data, 4 are pilots, 4 are not pilots. But on the 27 programs that we have that are domestically funded, you find that 25% of them, they're not pilots. So it shows that institutionalization is higher as long as we have got a lot of domestic funding commitments. Now, let's zero down to the trends of tax revenues in Africa. Why we're doing this? We want to expand on the concept of domestic financing. This does not begin to say donor financing or international financing is sort of that is not needed. It is needful, but we are seeing that if countries in Africa commit to domestic financing, it becomes better. So because of that, we have to look at the trends of the tax revenue, which is the domestic source of revenue that could be available for social assistance programs. So what we can see in this graph, we've got indirect taxes. The indirect taxes are taxes such as VAT, and they constitute more of the tax revenue. And these indirect taxes, you'll find that are paid by everyone. including the poor. And as a note of interest, a higher share of the poor's income contributes to VAT. So proportionally, the poor people do contribute to the tax revenue. And we can only use that to argue in our countries that it is necessary to then commit budgets towards lifting the poor out of poverty. Now, we also have this call to use domestic resources that our countries committed to. And this call was done in 2015, right, through the African heads of state in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. So even our superiors, they realize that it is very important to commit domestic resources. If we are to finance to meet SDGs as well as Agenda 2063, we need to finance both for adequacy as well as reach. By adequacy, we mean that the amounts transferred to poor people should be enough to lift them out of poverty. The reach simply means that we need to increase coverage so that more poor people are covered than currently are. If we do that, you will find that we will move to the top right corner where the SDGs as well as Agenda 2063 can be met. However, when we are struggling, we've got a choice of either making sure that programs are adequate but their reach is low. Should that happen, it means that we are financing with an idea of targeting. By targeting, we're saying who is selected to be a participant in a program. So because financing will not be enough to cover everyone, we then select a few to be covered. And then once we cover them, we say let's target them and we provide adequate transfers to them to lift them out of poverty. It could be at times that we finance to include coverage, that is to include as many people as is possible. So you will be now moving to institutions, that is where there is high coverage but low adequacy. By that we mean we have included a lot of people in the program. Perhaps because the program is rights-based, everyone has to be included, but you don't have money to have adequacy in terms of transfers. So that would mean you have reached a lot of people, but you are yet to do more in terms of improving adequacy. That's another way in which it could be approached. So if I'm to rank, definitely African countries need to improve both in terms of adequacy and reach. However, if they are failing to do both, they can opt for one. It could be adequacy or reach. Now, we may have countries that have got low adequacy and low reach. That is, their programs have got few people, and those few people are not financed much. So these will be countries where we need to do a lot of work in terms of promoting social assistance, promoting social insurance, so that coverage as well as adequacy may improve. And most of these are the countries that may need international funding. I will end with options that are available to improve our financing. This includes introducing new tax, which is not what a lot of people would like. particularly pay as you earn tax. People don't like their taxes increased. And you will find that in Africa, most countries find it easier to increase value added tax because people would hardly complain with an increase in value added tax compared to an increase in their incomes, in increase in tax in their incomes. So, what does this begin to tell us? It's telling us that it's easy to increase taxes on regressive tax. By regressive, we mean tax that does not help much on the poor. More reason why, if taxes are increased on VAT, we need to equally increase the amount transferred to the poor in the social budgets. We can also reduce illicit financial flows. These range in billions. And if we are to cut these illicit financial flows, we may have more money for social investments. Budgets can be reallocated. A lot of writers at times say, let's move budgets from military or something like that. Depending on the context of the political situation in a country, definitely this is an option, but in some countries it may not be. I've talked about international partners or donors, and this falls under social assistance. This marks the end of our financing of social investment in Africa. Thank you so much.